Introduction. Since mid-April, when the exchange market was liberalized, the monetary debate in Argentina has focused on how the dollar should behave and how it would be passed on to prices if the currency were to rise. Beyond the fact that most analysts have been significantly wrong in their forecasts, with the exception of a handful and the economic team, what is surprising is the persistence of the same analytical errors that keep these professionals on a losing streak, even before the change of government. This inbred behavior is understandable, especially if there are no costs for making mistakes when everyone else has, especially when the logic of the Oracle of Delphi prevails, who gave advice but did not make decisions. In short, what I want to point out is that even though everyone talks about the passer of the dollar's price movement to prices, this statement, although supposedly capable of having some empirical support, is false and implies a profound lack of knowledge of monetary theory. 2. The origin and nature of money. To understand the nature of money, we must first internalize what an economy without money, that is, a barter economy, would be like. In a pure exchange economy, individuals satisfy their needs by engaging in transactions with their peers, in which, in exchange for the goods they are willing to offer, they receive in return the goods offered by another individual. While it seems like a simple operation, the implementation of this process immediately collides with two realities. On the one hand, we have the problem of double coincidence, that is, it is necessary to find a pair of individuals with reciprocal needs. That is, the person he needs a certain good not only needs to find the person he will sell it to them, but also needs that person to be the same person he will accept in exchange a good that the first person is trying to sell. On the other hand, there is the problem of indivisibility, where the not so minor problem of double coincidence has already been solved. That is, the fact that the goods involved cannot be divided into the necessary proportions for the transaction to take place. I may want to eat bread, and the baker wants to listen to one of my economics talks. The point is that the minutes and content that I am willing to exchange for a kilo of bread will not be useful to the baker in making decisions. Faced with this adversity, man didn't cry or wait for someone to come and solve his problems. Thus, he observed that some goods were exchanged more than others and thus discovered indirect exchange. That is, a good that is not purchased for consumption but for exchange. Ultimately, in this process of searching for solution, he found commodity money. Hence, the first forms of money were cattle, linen, salt, tobacco, coffee, and, not going much further back in time, cigarettes in prisons. On the other hand, while these goods met the basic conditions that money must have to be valued as such, that is, serving as a unit of account and a generalized medium of exchange, they failed as a store of value. Basically, these goods being perishable, storing them presents a negative interest rate, that is, they would become worth less and less over time. And so, humankind arrived at metallic money. However, this was not without its drawbacks, as a problem of portability was compounded by the risks of moving large quantities of precious metals. Needless to say, faced with this difficulty, humankind developed certificates of deposit to be able to move around without so much weight on their shoulders. Naturally, there were always cheaters, which occurred when deposit houses began issuing unbacked certificates in their favor. Faced with the resulting disorder, the state emerged. Instead of working to restore order, it felt it couldn't compete in scams against people via taxes and decided to seize the monopoly on issuing money along with imposing legal tender, thus perfecting the robbery. The rest is history. 3. The monetary nature of inflation. In light of the previous point, it should be clear that money is nothing more than an indirect exchange good and is only used for the purpose of carrying out transactions, whether present transactional demand and/or future hoarding. Therefore, if we understand this, the demand for money is a demand derived from the total demand for goods and services in the economy, or more simply put, it is a mere demand. In this sense, the demand for money would be determined by the consumption vector of a time intertemporal, and its functional relationship would be given by the parameters that determine the consumption vector. Thus, just like consumption, the demand for money would be determined by the intertemporal price vector, which, in terms of general equilibrium, reveals the aim many economists make when formulating the demand for money as a function of income which arises from the sale of leisure time in the labor market plus the profit share of companies in which they have some type of stake, and the interest rate which is implicit in the intertemporal price vector, since it is the relative price of goods in the present with respect to future prices. Finally, to solve the equilibrium price vector, what Robert Lucas Jr. called the parameters are required. I preferences, Roman II technology, and Roman III endowments. In turn, if money existed, the monetary base would have to be added. In turn, the institutional structure regarding property rates should also be considered, although this would be the subject of another debate, so we simplify the point by assuming a private property economy. Note that if the demand for money is determined by the consumption pattern, and this ultimately depends on prices, which in turn are determined by underlying parameters, the real demand for money under normal conditions would be a granite function and, in equilibrium, should equal the real supply of money. Money equals monetary base divided by the price level. We thus arrive at the conclusion that inflation is always and everywhere monetary phenomenon generated by an excess supply of money, either because supply has increased and slush or demand has fallen, which leads to a loss of the purchasing power of money, that is, all prices expressed in monetary units rise. 4. The Hume-Cantillon effect, empirical mirage of the pass-through fallacy. While the result is overwhelming and fundamental to the design of a serious monetary policy aimed at ending inflation, it also requires patience. Specifically, the action of monetary policy is not instantaneous, as it operates with lags. In Argentina's case, this lag ranges between 18 and 24 months. That is, even if one turns off the printing press on the first day, one will have to go through the purgatory of inflation for at least a year and a half. Therefore, given the first phase of rebuilding the central bank's assets, which took 6 months to turn off the printing press, we expect that by mid-2026, inflation will be just a bad memory in the lives of Argentines. At the same time, inflationary purgatory can require additional time and slash or higher inflation rates if the presence of a monetary surplus money overhang is added. This type of phenomenon often arises in the case of price controls and capital controls. In the former, a symptom is a shortage of supplies, while in the latter, it manifests itself in an exchange rate gap and the loss of central bank reserves. Furthermore, in the case of capital controls, it generates an artificial increase in the demand for money, which implies an increase in the tax base of the inflationary tax, thus exacerbating the fraud at the hands of the state. On the other hand, as the months pass since the initial injection of money, the Hume-Cantillon effect takes hold, which originally showed the distributive effects based on the inflow of money into the economy. Thus, those who receive and spend at first, politicians are transacting with today's money and yesterday's prices, which causes harm to those receiving the money in different transactions over time. The downside of this is that not all prices rise simultaneously, rather, some rise first and others later. In line with this, and incredibly for pass-through fundamentalists, the most popular model for open economies with money is the Everett-Dornbusch, better known as the overshooting model. In this model, when faced with an excess supply of money, this translates into a jump in the exchange rate that is more than proportional to the rate of devaluation implicit in the rate of monetary expansion consistent with purchasing power parity PPP. Thus, once the adjustment in the goods market takes place and exportable balances increase, the exchange rate falls to the PPP level. What's interesting is seeing economists repeat these terms as part of the superfamily of citizenforms, yet fail to notice that behind them lies the Hume-Cantillon effect, which occurs as a consequence of the fact that while the goods market adjusts slowly, the financial market does so instantaneously. Thus, with excess supply of money generated, individuals flock to the financial market to seek foreign currency, while the generation of foreign currency is slow, which is why the exchange rate jumps much more than proportionally until the markets begin to balance. In other words, it makes no sense to talk about pass-through, since the price level will inexorably converge toward the PPP. Following the same logic, when excess supply is generated in the money market and this manifests itself in excess demand in the foreign exchange market, then, given that the dollar is a financial asset, it will rise first, followed by the price of tradable goods, then wholesale prices, then retail prices, and finally wages will rise, which is why devaluation is so unpopular. Ultimately, the causal relationship remains from the quantity of money to prices, and this history may also be the owner of the empirical evidence on which the idea of pass-through is based. However, speaking of pass-through is synonymous with very poor economic theory, since assuming a causal relationship running from the exchange rate to the price level implies working with an objective theory of value. Therefore, whether they like it or not, they are mistaken, since this way of thinking about economic analysis was superseded in 1871 by the work of Carl Menger, who developed the subjective theory of value in parallel with William Stanley Jevons and Leon Wowers. Of course, his heart may not have been anchored in the classical economist, and the basis of his error may date back to 1936, when John Maynard Keynes decided to destroy the entire Wexelian analytical framework, which is why he had the profession arguing about nonsense until 1972 and decided on an ad hoc basis to return to the objective theory of value. If you don't like the Hume-Cantillon argument nor the one based on value theory, I now propose a general equilibrium one. If we develop the complete micro-foundations of a general equilibrium model, the excess demand functions for each of the end goods in the economy depend on the end prices in the economy. In turn, if we add the money market, as described in the first part of this article, this implies that we have a system of n+1 homogeneous equations of degree 0, that is, they depend on relative prices. Furthermore, taking money as numerator, the unit of account, we know by Walras's law that if n markets are in equilibrium, the remaining markets will also be so, and it will be possible to determine n relative prices. Since they are in terms of money, the prices in question are monetary prices. In turn, this system can be said to have as exogenous variables, preferences, technology, endowments, and the quantity of money. Note that the idea of pass-through has a serious problem, since the price of foreign currency in the general equilibrium system is endogenous, whereas, according to the view of many local economists, the price of foreign currency is exogenous and thus determines all other prices. That is, if it is true that they use general equilibrium models as they boast, then pass-through does not exist, since it implies that the price of foreign currency is both an endogenous and exogenous variable. Logical inconsistency detected. End of debate. 5. Final reflections. Menger keeps watch. Throughout the various sections, a series of aspects linked to monetary theory were demonstrated that are of vital importance for correctly analyzing and understanding the policy pursued by the central bank. First, we derived the basis of the demand for money as a demand derived from the goods market. Based on this result, we demonstrated the monetary nature of inflation, and, in conjunction with this result, we demonstrated the theoretical invalidity of the pass-through. At the same time, we made it clear that its empirical validity is nothing more than a statistical mirage that is resolved within the framework of the monetary theory of inflation when we incorporate the Hume-Cantillon effect into the analysis. Finally, in light of the subjective theory of value, an additional reflection remains on the basis of Menger's imputation principle. In this theory, unlike the objective theory, where costs determine prices, the imputation principle states that prices determine costs, while prices are determined by preferences, scarcity, technology and resources, location, and time. Based on everything discussed above, let's suppose we have two goods A and B. Now, for some reason, there is an increase in demand for good at the expense of good B. Consequently, the relative price of A with respect to B must rise. That is, the price of A will rise and the price of B will fall. Thus, spending on good A will increase, and therefore spending on B will fall, which will push the price of B down. Now, if the central bank now comes along and believes that the price of B will not fall, and that this will generate a drop in the level of activity, what it will do is print money so that the price of B will not fall, although this will cause the price of A to rise more than proportionally until it reaches the relative price of the new equilibrium. Therefore, for inflation to occur, monetary validation by the central bank is necessary. In other words, if there is no monetary validation, the price level will not change, and it's all a matter of relative prices. What's more, let's suppose that, faced with a rise in the price of A, the sellers of good B want to raise the price. I'll tell you that Menger is waiting just around the corner to tell you that, due to the imputation principle, they won't be able to sell their products and will be left with warehouses full of merchandise, decreasing asset turnover and destroying its return. Sooner or later, unless you're Muskis, you'll learn. Now call good A the dollar and good B the rest of the goods. The story tells itself. Inflation doesn't occur when relative prices change without monetary validation. Finally, why do individuals continue to believe that a rise in dollar causes prices to rise? Basically, because for 90 years they've been right. Except during the convertibility law, every time the dollar rose, prices subsequently rose. And to top it all off, during the convertibility law, when the exchange rate was fixed, there was no inflation. Therefore, someone untrained in monetary economics may suffer the sensory effects of spurious correlation, just as they might come to believe that when many people put on their bathing suit, summer will arrive. However, one would expect that someone who has spent at least 4 or 5 years studying economics and even completed one or more graduate, doctoral, and postdoctoral studies, combined with a large number of years of experience in professional business, would not fall into these types of amateurish errors, easily correctable if variations in the money supply are included in the analysis. If we consider the Argentine case and its political class's addiction to fiscal deficits, it will not only be possible to explain the cascade of defaults, tax increases, and currency printing, which in the latter case generated an inflationary disaster, but the other side of the coin is the destruction of 5 currency symbols and the removal of 13 zeros from the currency. For the sake of the Argentine people, I hope they learn this lesson. May God bless the Argentinians. And may the forces of heaven be with us.